lived in a subdivision for several years, and the neighbor beside me they were from Cuba, and they worked really hard to get her mom out of Cuba to come, and they were so excited to get her there. Her mom was a little bit older, and she absolutely, positively, fiercely hated America. And they didn't hate America like ideologically, she hated living in America. And that was stunning. You got out of Cuba, right? And so I was asking her, I was thinking, why? And she's like, well, it's like living in a cemetery. The streets are completely and utterly silent. Nobody knows anybody. At night, all the cars go home and go in the doors and the blue lights come on. And what she was describing is in the subdivision, nobody was on the streets. Nobody was on the front porch. This subdivision, like many subdivisions, didn't have front porches. At night, everybody drove in, opened the garage doors, drove in the garage, closed the garage doors, didn't even talk to people in the driveway, and the blue lights came on, turned the TV on. And so all of a sudden, the technology that allows us to have no interactions with live people that may or may not have looked attractive is now something that causes us to constantly look for ways to interact with live people.
Hello, and welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And today we have a topic that is once again revisiting AI, but from a little bit of a different perspective than you may have heard us before, or perhaps expounding a little bit on what you may have heard us talk about on the podcast before. I recently came across this video that is by a guy on YouTube named Marques Brownlee. We'll have the video linked down below, where essentially there is a company that is showcasing a robot that is powered by AI, and the vision is that it will take care of all of your housework for you. So you can get this robot. For reference, it's humanoid looking, it's 5'6", it has, fully articulating arms, hands, fingers, all this stuff. And essentially the goal is that you can show it, here's where the dishes go, here's where the dishwasher is, here's where the laundry goes. And you can just kind of give it a tour of your home, and then it will autonomously go and take care of all of these menial tasks for you. It will do the dishes and put them back where you showed it. It will go and do your laundry and fold it for you and put it back in the drawers. It will even get the door for you. You can still ask it questions, so it can be connected to a large language model like ChatGPT. So it can just essentially be an extremely smart robotic house assistant for you. It will even go and charge itself when it senses that it's getting low on battery, so you never even have to worry about that. Now, for all of this, you're either paying a $500 a month convenient subscription fee, or you're paying $20,000 to actually own the thing. So this is not something that most likely you or I listeners are probably going to be affording anytime soon. But I just thought that there could be a lot of interesting possibilities for conversations around the function that this could, or potentially whether or not this robot should serve in our lives. So, Jonathan, I'm just curious to get your initial reactions to just the concept of a robot walking around your home doing your chores.
Well, first, I think the first thing you said was that, you show it where the laundry goes and where all this stuff happens. And I just was thinking that I'm not sure that AI has been developed yet that could figure out the chaos of my house. I think if you really want to test it out on sort of an extreme circumstance, let it come and try to live with us and see exactly how. I'm not even sure where my laundry goes necessarily week to week in terms of its transition from the laundry to my place and back and down without getting intercepted by a bunch of toddlers and messed up and rearranged and all that stuff. So just for context, listeners, David showed me this video. I was actually familiar with this robot. I think it's called Neo, which has some pretty interesting connotations if you're nerdy enough to have watched certain movies. And I was familiar with the concept. And to be honest, David, the first thing that goes to your head is what's the joke, right? Oh, that smartphone does everything. It'll do my dishes, right? This is yes, it will do your dishes, right? And that's the kind of sole purpose of this. And so it's finally the Jetsons got here, finally Star Wars got here, finally the droids are here, finally all that stuff. I think the first thing I saw was a comment, somebody asking, can you teach it to shoot a paintball gun? Just wondering. There's some interesting things to wonder there. There's some really, so I was let's take ChatGPT, which hallucinates and is not necessarily always known for doing the best things, and embody it. That sounds like a really great idea. So you're basically saying ChatGPT, which occasionally has encouraged people to commit suicide, now moves around my house. We went from, oh, that'd be cool to get my dishes done, to nightmare fuel pretty quickly. So there's there's kind of an initial wow, that'd be really cool. And then there's wow, that could be really scary. But I was going back, David, when you first asked me this, and I was thinking about two things. And the first is, well, let's start here. Let's rewind and say, so it's 2025, so 1925, is that enough? I don't know, 1915, 1920. If David, we can get some historical context for that.
Mhm.
What would you and I have done in our lives in 1920 or maybe 1880 that we don't have to do now? So
Ooh.
so the first one would be no dishwashers, right?
Yep.
Okay,
Wouldn't even exist.
So no dishwasher. So we'd have to wash dishes by hand. In my house, that would be a fairly substantial chunk of work. Washing machines would be different. I think I guess let's get pre-electric, because I don't know if
Mhm.
that's 1920 if everything's electrified. I mean, obviously some places are and some aren't.
Right.
So maybe we could kick back to like 1900. May or may not be electrified. But okay, so you got laundry's now a pretty big deal as
Mhm.
well. All right, what else? What have you got thinking like just day-to-day stuff?
Well, I mean, realistically, that's information too is one of the big ones,
Right.
because at that point, you don't even have to go nearly that far back to realize that if you needed information, like there may not even be nearly as much of a like public access to information into books as we had even just 40 years ago. So that's a huge thing that's different.
Yeah, so that's intriguing in terms of, okay, so we're talking about this robot. This robot lands on some sort of YouTube channel or internet post, and instantly the world's kind of talking about it. It would have been possible in 1900-ish, around in those times, that, there'd be things happening that you didn't know existed, and you could spend decades and not know they existed,
Mhm.
right? I mean, like,
Yep.
if it would have to be big enough to get into a few mass-produced communication devices, newspapers primarily. If we're going to jump into electricity, radio, maybe, but let's go back to newspapers. And even then, the distribution of those newspapers is slow, and so when we think about, like, think of any obscure subject, well, we'll just Google that and figure it out. Back then, you may not even have the imagination for the obscure subject, and if you did, it may be patently impossible for you to learn about it.
It's crazy that we can get updates on what's happening, halfway across the world in Ukraine, pretty much just a few minutes after it happens. And in that time, that would have, if it was possible for us to get that information, would have taken weeks.
Right. So, okay, you wouldn't eat bananas in January. You wouldn't eat oranges probably at all, right? I mean, you may not eat bananas at all. You would have much less choices when it comes to food. Like, it's like go to the local grocery store. You'd have to probably be growing some of your own food. And not everybody, but a lot of people would be.
Central heat and air wasn't a
Right.
thing. So there was a
you're
whole lot
talking
of
about
other methods for that.
Yeah, you're shoveling coal, or you're splitting wood, or you're doing something. Transportation would obviously be much different. Even at 1900, we're not, we're talking about, the sort of socioeconomic status that we're in. We're probably talking about horse and buggy type situation, feet,
Right.
so walking. So, okay, so I was just kind of going through those things because one of my first thoughts was, is this a natural progression, and are we nostalgic for the things that we're not doing then? And I think there's some interesting things. What did you say you did this morning, David?
I went out and went for a run.
I don't think anybody was going for a run in 1900, like for fun, right? Right. I mean, like, let's just think about that for a second. So I don't think anybody is taking a run in 1900 for the heck of it, like just because it's like, I want to get up this morning and go for a run.
Unless like you're seriously pursuing like a professional career in athleticism, which is even less of a possibility then than it is now.
Yeah, you don't even have a lot of high school track teams, but you maybe got some of the boys to get together and run at the state fair, or the county fair or something like that. But and so why do you run, David?
I mean, mostly for my health, so that I can just like continue to keep muscle and stay active.
Yeah, so you run mostly for your health. I run too, and I would say the same thing. And so, but we both run for two reasons. First is certainly physical. Second is spiritual or mental. I mean, like there's some clearing of your mind, reducing stress. Also, kind of pressing yourself. But that's interesting. People didn't in 1900. I think because those things were less of a need. There wasn't much of a need for physical fitness if you're splitting all your own wood every day, walking to get to most of the places you need to go to. And with lack of communication, there may not be as much need for mental clarity. I mean, like, there's less to kind of have to sort through and process, which is not to say people aren't people and have some of the same things. right? So that's interesting. I'm just thinking about food. Like, how many people do you know, David, that are kind of either doing or want to be quote unquote homesteaders?
Too terribly many, a handful, I'd say.
But you got a handful, right? I mean, like, and
Exist,
it's
yeah.
definitely, if
They're
you
out there.
look at trends or TikTok trends or something like that, I mean, there's
Mm-hmm.
definitely some growing. There's always some level of the population that wants to do that. But 100 years, 1900, nobody's wanting to be a homesteader. I mean, like,
Yeah,
they're all working
that's
to
not a
get
trend.
off the
That's a
farm.
reality
Yeah.
of life.
Yeah. So there's kind of but the question is, why do people do that? Well, because they're worried about their food sources. They're worried about they want some connection to their food. They want some connection to the land. They want some connection to reality in some sense. So that's interesting. I don't know. What else, David? Like, what else would we think about here in terms of, what are some things that we're doing that we didn't have to do then because we had to do then? Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
running now because you didn't have to run then, but you do have to run now because you have to kind of make up for that physical gap.
Yeah. Well, and there was nothing like a Walmart or a Kroger or anything like that
Right.
back in the day. So if you wanted something specific, like chances were there wasn't some sort of all-stop shop for most of those things. Like if you wanted something specific, you had to go to a specific store, and most likely you had a personal relationship with someone who was in the supply chain for whatever particular product, whether it's food or a desk or chair or whatever other sort of thing that you might be buying. Is that like there's much more of a personal relationship rather than just a large corporation that's just manufacturing a ton of these things.
Well, and we can say that there's community.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So yeah, like, let's be clear. Like, we're not talking about utopia. We're not talking about a golden age. We're not saying that everything was better. And there's some obvious things that weren't better. We can get into that. So
Yeah, you
so I
can
don't wanna-
pretty clearly compare the life expectancies that are different.
Well,
in those
we
periods.
could compare life expectancies. We could compare medical realities. We could compare nutrition. We could compare opportunity. We could compare the ability to kind of live out your dreams. We could compare things like racism. Certainly, we could compare relative
reading
wealth.
level. Yeah.
Yeah. So well, reading level was probably higher, but we can no, seriously. I mean, like, the literacy rate of colonial America and then on through is absolutely quite stupendous compared to today. So let's not get confused. We're not talking about a golden age, and we're not talking about some nostalgia for things that are past. I'm just more interested in thinking about, like, what are the things that people were doing then that they didn't have to do, that people say, oh, that's a relief, but then they try to turn around and replace them. So, for example, we see this in the kind of business that we're in. People are starving, dying, just so hungry for community. That's because technology has removed the need. I lived in a subdivision for several years, and the neighbor beside me they were from Cuba, and they worked really hard to get her mom out of Cuba to come, and they were so excited to get her there. Her mom was a little bit older, and she absolutely, positively, fiercely hated America. And they didn't hate America like ideologically. She hated living in America. And, that was a little stunning. You got out of Cuba, right? And so I was asking her, why? And she's like, well, it's like living in a cemetery. And I said, what do you mean when it's living in a cemetery? She said, well, the streets are completely and utterly silent. Nobody knows anybody. At night, all the cars go home and go in the doors, and the blue lights come on. And what she was describing is, in the subdivision, nobody was on the streets. Nobody was on the front porch. This subdivision, like many subdivisions, didn't have front porches. At night, everybody drove in, opened the garage doors, drove in the garage, closed the garage doors, didn't even talk to people in the driveway, and the blue lights came on, turned the TV on. And so technology, replaced the need to deal with your neighbor. Now, in 1900, you might have a lot of people that say, I don't have to deal with my nasty neighbors. I don't have to deal with the jerks at the general store. I don't have to. I mean, like, that could have been a relief. That could have been a posited as an advantage. And yet, jump forward, and all of a sudden, the technology that allows us to have no interactions with live people that may or may not have looked attractive is now something that causes us to constantly look for ways to interact with live people. So I'm just thinking about that. I'm trying to project that forward and say, all right, so Neo comes in and he does all your dishes, and he does all your vacuuming, and etc. What I think that the utopian vision here, in fact, I looked at the company's website, and their kind of front video shows a somewhat older couple playing cards, which I thought was a very interesting choice. Playing cards at a coffee table while the robot's going back and forth behind them and opens the door, carries in the groceries, is dusting the bookshelf, running a vacuum cleaner.
Mm-hmm.
And the implication is we can spend all this time talking, and the older couple seem like they're smiling and getting along really fabulously, and they're playing cards together. And so the implication would be you have more time for relationships. My question would be, David, does that is there historical precedent for that being an accurate vision of what would happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent question to be thinking on, because really, like, there's just this always with technology, there's always like a cost in human element to it. Like, for example, you can even think of careers like phone switchboard operators that are completely gone now. And back in the time where those were prevalent, there was a decent chance where if you were on the phone regularly, especially as a business person, you were regularly interacting with people who were in the switchboard operator office, and there's a decent chance that you would be able to have some sort of brief rapport with them even at some points. But that's something that's completely gone now. I'm not saying that we should go back to that time necessarily. Right. I think that our current system is significantly better. We can just hit a button and we can immediately contact exactly the person we're contacting. But I'm just saying that, like, there is just an element of that advancement now where there is no longer an additional element of human interaction because of that advancement. And that's, again, not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. It's just all of these little things bit by bit over time that have just added up to the point where we're here now. And it shouldn't surprise us at this point that feelings of isolation and loneliness are at an all-time high. And we are having anxiety and depression rates absolutely skyrocket because people's actual real human interaction levels have gotten reduced so much by just these daily habits that you're talking about, because people are not intentionally participating in community. And it's just a challenge because, I'm somebody who's passionate about technology. I love finding new ways to make a process more efficient, and I get excited about the possibilities of, a robot who can interact with its environment and be able to tell, oh, this is where the dish should go. Like, just all of the technology that goes into that, I think, is super cool. Like, it's a lot of fun to look at and to see the possibilities of how we can make things like that work. And, like, they bring up the fact that it's in the home of an elderly couple. This could be really, really helpful for certain groups of people, like the elderly or people who have mobility issues, like someone who is suddenly wheelchair bound and isn't able to, like, reach the certain levels and just needs help with certain activities. This could be a major help for them. And so there's a lot of benefits to that. I guess there's just also the possibility of, what do we lose when we give up a lot of those other essential things? Because I think that those everyday mundane tasks that we just think about the possibility of offloading, I think there's just an element of that is a part of what keeps us grounded as people. I think there's the example that we often think of the out-of-touch billionaire, that just has people that, do all of their yard work and take care of all the things in their $1 million mansion. And essentially that's kind of the dream that is being offered that's being made more accessible now. It's still not terribly accessible, but more accessible now.
Well, I don't know, man. $20,000. I mean, that's a cheap car these days. I mean, we're close to mass market, I would say. I mean, like, so this is probably what most expensive it's going to be. I mean, if you talk about mass producing things, I mean, that they tend to start out high. I mean, that, to me, when you said 20,000, I would have thought there'd been a one before that too. I would have thought $120,000. So 20,000 to me sounds, pretty, not as expensive as one might think. I wonder. So you said the billionaire thing, and I was thinking along those same lines. I have you ever seen, and this is for the listeners and for David as well, have you ever seen the show or read the what's that guy's name? Anyhow, Jeeves and Wooster. Have you ever seen the Jeeves and Wooster show?
Nope.
We're talking about we're talking about an old British show that most sane people don't watch. And so PG Wodehouse wrote the books, Jeeves and Wooster. And most people know Just Ask Jeeves. I think there was an internet site that's probably now long gone.
Okay, yes, I have heard of Ask Jeeves. I've heard of that.
So Jeeves, so here's the point I'm driving at. Jeeves was the butler, okay? And so the P.G. Wodehouse books and then the show was this comedic thing where, the butler, who's considered to be the servant, clearly has all the brains in the outfit, and the young gentleman that he takes care of is a complete idiot, right? A nice, affable idiot, but still an idiot. And so the interaction is, the idiot getting into problems and then his butler sort of getting them out of it. But it's not his butler, it's his valet or valet, depending on how you pronounce it. It's the gentleman's gentleman, I think is the thing. Now, It's a fun show. My family has quirky, like some quirky British humor type stuff, and so we've watched them, and I can recommend it as a fun show. But the point that has always been fascinating to me is that that would have been a time when a proper English gentleman, not maybe necessarily of our socioeconomic status, David, but not too far above us, that would have been standard, that they'd have a valet. And, get a little higher up when you have a butler. And then, there was a time period, and there's a lot of interesting racial and economic factors to play in this, but there was a time period when upper middle class would have assumed that they would have had a cook, maybe a gardener, a housekeeper. Like those kinds of things would have been fairly standard. And so I'm always a little bit curious, like, is there a market for valets out there these days? I mean, do people have butlers anymore? Like, does Bill Gates have a butler? Does Elon Musk have a butler? Because you can't.
Good question.
You don't really think about them having it.
Yeah.
I mean, I assume the queen. The queen's dead. Sorry, I'm assuming the king has a butler, right? I mean, like you expect
Right,
that to happen,
right.
But like think about your typical, American tech bro billionaire or tech sis. I'm not trying to be one gender here, but I mean, do they have? We hear them say, like, some of them have personal chefs, but that's kind of like a high end job. They have
Sure.
personal trainers, maybe some chauffeurs out there. I don't know. Valets and butlers aren't so much a thing anymore. But all right, a little more homeschool for you. Did you ever read the Bobbsey Twins? I think you're probably too sophisticated.
Yep, not familiar with that one either.
Okay, that's fine. It's the Bobbsey Twins were like these little, I don't know, it was like a corporate, it's like the Hardy Boys in the sense that, like,
Okay.
they had multiple authors under one pen name, formulaic plot, stuff like that. But if you read some of the early ones, and these are probably banned now, they have a cook and they have a housekeeper, but they're not a rich family. Like the plot line is not that these are super rich. The plot line is that this is a fairly normal American family with 4 kids, and so that's considered to be kind of normal. Okay, so I don't know where that actually falls in reality. If we're back in 1920 or 1900, how many people actually have household staff?
Right.
But there was a period of time when upper middle class household staff was fairly normal. And so what did that do to those people? In other words, you said out of tech billionaire, but upper middle class family in 1900, 1910. Let's set aside the racial implications of certain parts of the country. Okay, so that there's something serious there, but we're not talking about that on this particular subject.
Right.
So let's get you in a place where you're paying these people, right? There's no racial component to this, and you have a housekeeper that cleans the house, and you have a cook that cooks most of the meals. So mom, especially, is now a little bit more freed up to do some things. The family's got. Was that an out of touch family, and did they have a nostalgia for that? And where did that, I think it was an economic factor that made that untenable in terms of not having people willing to pay for that. But that would be an interesting parallel because that's close to what we're looking at here, right?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. The thing I would wonder on that, though, is how would we today make use of that same freedom of opportunity, that same freed up time?
Would watch
now
YouTube
versus
videos, clearly.
when then, right?
Play video games. Yeah, that's
yeah. Would we
they might have written a book
productive?
that's so culturally. So in a time when there was less distractions and less communication, you could maybe spend the time to learn those things that you otherwise couldn't have learned because you had some of that free time.
We are more efficient than we ever have been, possibly, as a society, technologically, culturally. We have far more mechanisms to have more time to do things than ever possible, and yet we seem to be busier than possible and more isolated and just have our nose to our grindstones that look something like this more than we ever have before. And I don't think that necessarily says specifically about how bad advances in technology that makes us more efficient are. I think that says a lot about how our mindset is operating on what we're doing with it.
Well, and that gets to the heart of something I was thinking about here with this, David. I'm glad you said that, is that last night I taught one of our live sessions for our Navigate course that we have. There's a pretty large class in last night. Of course, taught online, so there's a little technology aspect there. And the heart of this particular segment of Navigate is, to think about life purpose theory and life purpose practice. And I start by saying, hey, we live in this really interesting time where you get to, like most of you are actually stressed out about finding your life purpose. And just so you know, that's a crazy thing to be stressed out about for most of the people in history. You know, like the vast majority of people that have ever lived, have ever drawn breath on this planet, never thought about life purpose. Their life purpose was to survive till tomorrow or to next year or whatever, right? And so the fact that you get to worry about it and that you're stressed about it, that's a phenomenal, unbelievable, crazy sliver of the population, the percentage ability to do that. And you should, you know, at some level be grateful for that. And I don't mean that in like you ungrateful wretches. I mean it more like sometimes it's just like some perspective is helpful here. And it's a good thing for us to remember. And then we go on and we argue and we say, you know, to find your life purpose, most people think, you know, even the church teaches sometimes, you know, God has given you a purpose and you have to discover what that purpose is. Just for the record and to put our cards on the table, I think that's garbage. I think that's a stupid, absolutely ridiculous assertion on multiple levels. And you know, if you ever want to hear my real opinion about that, just sign up for Navigate. But what I argue is say is like, as a Christian, you already know what your purpose is: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and your neighbor as yourself. And so then we teach the students, we say, well, there's the process here. It's purpose first. And then when you know that purpose, it gives you the freedom and the ability to act. And my thesis for this is that as humans, ideas precede action. I don't know why that looks. Maybe instinct precedes action in animals. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how that all goes together. But we can definitely, as a bona fide card-carrying human, I know that ideas precede action. Bad ideas precede bad actions. Good ideas precede good action. If you don't know that, you can look up any YouTube fail video. You know, it's the version of Hold My Beer would be the bad idea precedes action, right? Okay. So,
another way to look at it is that we like to think that we make logical decisions and that we don't have emotions, but really all that we're doing is we're just coming up with logic to justify our emotional decisions 95% of the time.
That's a fantastic thesis for our tactical communications class. We're going to teach tonight, by the way. And so ideas precede action. And so, but action is how you actually figure out and move forward in life. So, you know, we tell students, if you want to figure out what you do in life, you don't sit there by thinking, navel gazing and going, well, I thought, I want to be a CPA. That's what I want to do in my life, right? I mean, some people get there and that's a gift. Most people don't. You get it by doing things. Oh, I like numbers. I like organization. I like helping businesses. So, okay, now I should be a CPA. Like you have to get out there and you have to do some things. And then you have to fail and you have to try and you have to take action. And then you have to decide and you have to reflect. You have to, you know, did this work or did it not? But to take good action that you don't mind failing at, you have to have a good idea to precede it. And the good idea is, you know, your purpose. Love Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, your neighbor, yourself. All right. All that was preamble for, you know, then we tell students there's not a magic formula here, but there is a call to live deliberately. The people that deliberately ask those questions are people that get farther ahead than people that don't. And so in this kind of context, we should live deliberately, right? What does it mean to love the Lord our God with our heart, mind, and soul, and our neighbors ourselves? And will Neo help or not help with that? And I think that that's less of a binary answer and more of an intention answer. Because I tell you, David, I'm thinking about my own life, and I'm literally going, I got to get a new minivan, which, you know, you could pay. I'm probably not going to pay $20,000 for, but you could pay $20,000 for.
Right.
If instead I could pay $20,000 for a robot that would let my extraordinarily hardworking wife get a few more hours or a day a week free from some of the routine stuff that we're doing all the time.
There's an argument to be made there.
I don't think she's going to fill it with YouTube channels, right?
Probably not.
I think she's going to fill it with two little rugrats that run around here and take up a lot of time and stress and energy. And so in that sense, that sounds incredibly attractive. On the other hand, I'm haunted by the fact that you went running this morning, and if I had a little more time today, what I'd really like to do is go down and split wood. And I'm splitting wood because we have failed to move into the 21st century, and I'm still heating the house primarily with wood, so that's a whole separate situation. But I'm also doing it because I like to split wood, because splitting wood is one of the few things I do in my life where there is something that starts and then there's something that's finished. There's a pile of wood that needs split, and when we're done, there's a wood rack full of wood, and it represents something honest and useful, and it means that I'm going to be heated through the winter. And just so you know, if I don't split wood, I just have to burn oil, and I live in an old farmhouse, and that, you know, when the furnace turns on, I hear my bank account drain. So there's, you know, I'm not going to freeze to death if I don't split the wood, but my bank account is going to mean that I'm going to go bankrupt instead. And so there's something about that. So, you know, could Neo split my wood? Probably, but I wouldn't want him to, because that's one of the few things that I do that I actually feel like I can see progress on which is not to say I dislike the rest of the things I do. It's just that there's something real about splitting wood that I'm loath to get up. Just like there's something real about running. You and I are both runners that, if you told me that I could take a pill and get the same results, there is attraction to that, but it's not really.
No, not at all.
I don't know. React to that, David.
Yeah, I think you're right. I like that you said that it's not necessarily as a matter of, how did you put it? It's not a binary decision.
Right.
It's what was the way you put it?
Well, I said I think that this living deliberately is to what does it mean to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and your neighbor as yourself. Now, there's a binary aspect to that, in that that probably means you shouldn't shoot them. I mean, right. There's some moral clarity there, but in certain situations, does that mean that you should or shouldn't use Neo? I don't think that that's a yes or no answer. I think that has a lot to do with your motives and your heart. But the thing with motives and heart is that you can't just glide into that, because from a Christian standpoint, we would say, if you glide into that, we know what the answer is going to be. It's going to be desperately wicked, right? So you have to know your heart, and you have to ask, and given the choice, you're going to let Neo do more and more things that allows you to be more and more sinful, frankly. Just to be like almost shockingly crude about it, and I'm not trying to do it because I'm trying to be ugly, but like, put Neo into the life of most men, perhaps even single men, but maybe married men as well. Give them a lot of free time, and the result is not likely to be literature written and fancy things done. The result is likely to be more pornography consumed.
Yeah.
And without constantly examining that motive and looking at that, and I use pornography because it's kind of an extreme, but also because there's a trend there, right? It's real. And so like, given without active resistance to that, on the other hand, give Neo to some people, and you're looking at the ability for somebody to create the next big thing, the best beautiful piece of art, to write a phenomenal story. I mean, there's certainly a situation where you inject Neo into somebody's life and they can do something they never could have done before, and it's really wonderful. But I think that requires a pretty intense input of energy and clarity to get there, and that's the challenge.
Yeah. I think there's a lot that has to be set up intentionally, aside from just, do I have this thing that will free up more of my time? It's just, have you set up the rest of your life? Have you set up your value structures, the way that you have set up your daily habits, and just the routines, and just the choices that are almost by default at this point that most of us make day in and day out? Because I think you touched on this earlier, is that by default, a lot of us tend to go more towards things that are leisurely or that waste time, and so we have to train ourselves a lot to eventually want to go about doing those things that are ultimately better for us, may end up taking more time but are harder. For example, like, I had to train a lot for myself to be able to get to the point where I enjoyed running. For about the first 6 months where I was doing it,
right,
I hated it every single time.
And it's painful.
It was very painful. It was very painful. I felt like I was terrible at it. I kind of was terrible at it. And it just, like, I knew it was ultimately good for me, so I just had to keep making the decision to just get on the treadmill for however long I could do it, and just do it over and over again. And this is not some, way of saying, David is amazing at coming up with habits. This is just the reality of how all of us end up making choices, is that the way that you train yourself to be able to use your time wisely is you just have to be able to make those hardest choices day in and day out, and understand what that time and what those choices add up to doing.
And so here's perhaps where the biggest danger lies, right? So David, you have to train yourselves to do. You had to go through the pain, you had to go through the suffering, you had to go through the endurance, you had to go through the breathlessness, you had to have the discipline to do that. And the result was, yay, you like running. Oh, that's not the only result, man, clearly, right? I mean, like, the result is all the spiritual training and the physical training and the ability to endure discomfort and to push through and to have a bigger vision and to work on it, stuff like that. Those, you could stop running tomorrow and those things are likely to transcend. And my guess is that your ability to learn how to run impacted how you do your job, how you deal with relationships, how you, so many things. And so now it's like, okay, Well, if you don't have to do that now, but it's not a complete equivalency. We're not talking about David taking a pill and getting running fitness. We're talking about David not having to wash dishes, so he got a little more time running. But at what point does that technology, whether it's Neo or something else, enable you to do something that would have taken perseverance and work, which means you're getting robbed of the spiritual training and the spiritual discipline and the riches that come past that, which we know, being a runner, having that ability, I'm guessing, as a runner, transforms your entire perception of what you can and can't do, not just physically, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, and to take it to another step, thinking about doing dishes, when I walk by the sink and see that there's a bunch of dishes there, pretty much every single time there's a part of me that just goes, ugh, I do not want to take care of that.
I'm going to let Molly do that.
Right, there's a part of me that wants to say that.
I'm going to let my kid do it. Yeah, right. So.
Right. But then whenever you go and you say, you know what, I don't want to do that, but I'm going to do it anyway, partially because I just want it taken care of, but also partially because now that means that the other people, this is something that takes care of the other people that I love who live in this household.
Here's an active service. So what happens when you see that sink full of dishes and say, Neo, chop, chop, get on this boy. And the robot comes over and washes it. Not quite the same and earns you the same kind of capital with your spouse as, it's not my chore. It's not my night. It's not however you divide things up. And
right. And do it. Yeah, it's just part of those daily moments of self-sacrifice where you just go to and take the opportunity to say hey, this is not convenient for me, but because that is the way that Christ taught me to live, is to live to be able to serve others and hold their needs above my own. This is a small way where I'm putting that into practice on a daily basis. Whenever I look at the dishes, say, ugh, I don't want to do this, but choose to do it anyway out of love. And it's hard at first and it gets easier over time. I think when we lose out on more of those little self-sacrificial disciplines, we end up losing out on a lot more than just a little bit of time that we end up putting towards something that isn't as useful.
So you're saying if I sold my motorcycle and bought Neo, I'd have to sell 2 or 3 or 4 of my motorcycles, 4 or 5 of my motorcycles to buy Neo, the kind of motorcycles I ride. But anyhow, would that be an active sacrifice and love? Yeah, I mean that slightly. I'm saying that a little bit tongue in cheek, but there is a important connection to that. So, well, I feel like we could go all Joe Rogan and probably talk about this for another 2.5 hours and get somewhere. But I'm not entirely sure that, unlike Joe Rogan, everybody would stick with us for 2.5 hours. So this was not something that we came into. In fact, we had a quick discussion. We said, let's not talk about this before. Let's just jump on this and start the recording and think about this. And so I would submit to you, maybe if we do pull some conclusions from this, is that I don't know whether you should own Neo or not, or buy Neo or use it or all those kinds of things. I would be loath to kind of make a commitment one way or the other. But I am utterly and totally convinced that to live deliberately, to think clearly about what we choose to do and how we spend our time, and to understand the implications of that, especially in areas of, will this train me spiritually? Will this train me physically? Will this enable me to do an act of service to somebody else? I don't know how those things all fall in interaction with having a robot that washes your dishes, but I do know that those are essential questions. And if you fail to deliberately question and answer those questions, then you will inevitably choose incorrectly. That from a Christian worldview, you will trend towards doing the things that are selfish, doing the things that are not healthy, doing the things that do not train your flesh, but instead weaken it. And it's worth knowing that as you look at all these things, whether you're using ChatGPT on your computer or whether you're actually inviting Neo in to open the door, haul the groceries, dust the bookcase, and wash the dishes.
Yeah. So. And I think on top of that, that's an excellent way to put it. And on top of that, how is this enhancing or detracting from the people around you and your community? I think is another really important factor. It could be from that, it could be enhancing or detracting from how much time you're participating in community and also how you're serving the others around you. And the answer may be yes, the answer may be no, but that is also an essential part of thinking through something like this. And something that I think we should all think more about in this context of technology and just in the everyday choices that we make is how is this going to affect the other day-to-day people that I am in community with on a regular basis.
Absolutely. And if you're looking for community, I can offer you a 100% Neo-less community in the form of Unbound. Whether you're a high school student interested in our Equipment Explorer programs, or whether you are post-high school and interested in our Send programs, we can tell you that even without Neo to do our dishes, this is one of the most famous, it's not famous, one of the most amazing, and I was going to say fabulous, and some of that crossed into famous communities that I've ever been a part of, in terms of people who really care, who are serious about living deliberately, who are asking those hard questions and are sharpening each other as they try to ask those questions and answer them together. And if you're looking for a place that helps you guard from falling into that weakness, spiritual weakness, physical weakness, and just kind of laziness, this is a community that constantly pushes and challenges its members, and I would love for you to consider being a part of it. You can go to beunbound.us to check that out. Might pitch something else here in terms of telling you that if you say, well, I'm interested in that, but I'm not sure how that works, or sometimes it's like, well, I heard it on a podcast, but are those people real? I mean, who knows, David? We could be AI generated at this point, although I honestly think if I was AI generated, I'd both sound and look a little better. But anyhow,
we would hope so, wouldn't we?
Yeah, I mean, well, David at least has got the AI generated voice for sure. So, but he sounds better than any AI you've ever heard, so you know it's authentic. But the point here is, if you want to get a sense of what this looks like and how this works, something we're doing a lot more of this year is that we've got a crew and a team of people that would love to come to your neighborhood. And if you can put 10, 15 plus people in our seats, we'd be delighted to come to a live presentation. That presentation would be, sort of a synthesis of the things that we've learned over this past year as we've been working with our students, and we would be delivering value to anybody that came. But in the process, would also give you some immediate hands-on and in-person instruction and a look at what we do in Ascend, in Equip, in Explore, and what we do at Unbound. And if you're interested in that, you can go to beunbound.us and you can contact us, and we would be delighted to work with you in the details of how to set that up. Thank you so much for listening. If you happen to have purchased a Neo or even rented one, I would be interested in hearing from you and how that all worked out for you, and if they indeed can wash the dishes, because I'm honestly still considering that a little bit. So until next time, Neo or not, be unbound.